Okay, so thank you. Today I will analyze how the Estonian national activists discussed non-territorial autonomy, but actually mainly in 1917, as Boris mentioned, the interval cultural autonomy law is well known, but there is less research into the roots of this law. And the paper is part of my doctoral dissertation that I'm writing as part of this broader ERC-funded project. And yes, the law itself is more studied, but closer analysis of the year 1917 shows that many activists in Estonia discussed different forms of autonomy, including non-territorial autonomy, and within this broader Russian imperial or revolutionary Russian framework. And one of the, we know that, let me briefly mention the interval autonomy as well. It was mainly designed after the needs of Baltic Germans. Two minority self-governments were established, the Jewish cultural self-government and German cultural self-governments. And these basically existed until the very end of the Estonian independence, although during the authoritarian years the competencies, the powers were somewhat limited. One of the first activists, Estonian activists in 1917, about whom I want to talk a bit, is Karl Luts. Karl Luts was an Estonian educator and political activist born and living in St. Petersburg, actually, and he was himself a Menshevik. And in 1917, he published a series of articles, which were later published as a separate book, National or Exterritorial Autonomy and Our Settlements. And Lutz argued that ethnically diverse Russia must treat all nationalities equally and supported the self-determination of nations. The form he proposed was intrastate. He proposed a federal model for Russia, designed after Canada and Switzerland, but the deficiency of pure territorial national model, in Lutz's view, was the fact it did not provide a satisfactory answer to the national question, and that's and because Lutz also saw that ethnicities lived mixed, as he put it, quote, as they just came back from the Tower of Babylon, end of quote. This created tensions, territorial disputes, and territorial autonomy had to be complemented with non-territorial autonomy provisions. And how to, if we implement non-territorial autonomy, how to determine who is the member of this autonomous community. Here, Lutz relied heavily on Otto Bauer and Karl Renner. It was to be the individual who autonomously, freely declared his or her ethnic belonging. But in this argumentation, Lutz very much followed what Otto Bauer had written. Otto Bauer had criticized the Moravian Compromise, saying that it wasn't entirely free, because if the membership of this national community was contested by other members, it was ultimately the parish authority who had the final say, and Lutz very much took over this very argumentation and even occasionally word by word quoted Otto Bauer. In terms of the nature and structure of autonomy and its powers, Lutz relied more on Karl Renner, on his 1902 book, The Struggle of Austrian Nations for the State. And he basically reproduced the very model of Renner. The nation would take administering national and educational affairs into their hands. It had to be mainly cultural, but still proposing it in a different context. Lutz treated it somewhat differently, interpreted in its own way, and he also proposed including some economic competencies. For instance, he proposed that autonomy should have right to provide financial support for these Estonians in particular. He argued for autonomy for Estonians living in settlements, and he had in mind these agrarian settlement communities. Basically, the aim was to offer loans and financial assistance to these dispersed and relatively poor communities. However, the main point of departure for Lutz was territoriality, and he considered national territorial units as the main building blocks of the Russian Federation. For example, in his text, he actually didn't focus on the very Estonian territory, arguing that luckily Estonia is more or less ethnically homogeneous, and didn't really propose implementing this model within the Baltic context. Another important aspect which I briefly mentioned, that for Lutz, the focus was his own national community, other Estonians living in other parts of Russia, and this question for Estonian national activists was pressing, whereas in Estonia the number of Estonians was only a little over a million. In the rest of Russia, roughly 250,000 Estonians were living. And when, after the February Revolution, Estonian ethnic autonomous unit was created, these communities or national activists felt that these dispersed settlements were left out from this national territorial project. And this I forgot, but this is a short overview of ideas of Lutz. And now I will move on to another activist named Hans Kruus. Hans Kruus was an Estonian activist. He was the member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and was the main activist arguing for non-territorial autonomy in Estonia. He was socialist revolutionary, but his later career is actually even more interesting. This is his youth years. Later, during the interwar years, he was the professor of history at University of Tartu and the founder of Estonian national academic history writing tradition, actually. And in 1940, he was the vice prime minister of Estonian Soviet puppet government. And in summer 1917, in his extensive articles, he basically tried to connect three strands of thought: individualism, nationalism, and Marxism. His theoretical construction began with the idea of free self-determination of an individual, and from this he derived basically the self-determination of nations, as each individual is free to determine oneself. Also, all peoples are free to determine themselves. And which form of self-determination did Kruus support? His support also belonged to the federal organization of Russia. And he actually, in theoretical terms, opposed also to pure ethno-territorial principle in forming the federal units of Russia, because however you draw the borders, you will always have minorities. However, if you look at the very practical cases, then in the Estonian case, he also actually supported creating a separate Estonian territorial unit within the Russian Federation. But in theoretical terms, he opposed to pure ethno-territorial principle, and again to mainly protect these dispersed Estonian settlement communities. He argued that nations had to be turned into public law institutions which autonomously govern their national affairs. And again, these principles that Otto Bauer and Karl Renner had put forward, membership had to be free choice of the individual. He also ruled out the possibility that individuals would, for opportunistic reason, opt out from the national register, because he was also, his core belief was nationalist. He also thought that proper nationalists would never renounce their community. In delimiting the powers of autonomies, he again followed Renner's approach. It had to be purely cultural, including schooling, theaters. And Cruz basically exemplifies how non-territorial autonomy model was for left-wing politicians an attempt to find a middle ground between purely national ideology, which often ignored economic disparities, and this Russian Marxist tradition, which being the ideology of the dominant nation, very often did not pay attention to national issues. And if we briefly go through circulation, how the ideas circulated, then there are a few points that I would briefly mention. One is, let's say, reading the original texts and translation and adaptation. Yes, these texts by Otto Bauer and Karl Renner were never translated into Estonian, but these two activists, they either read the original text by Otto Bauer or Karl Renner, or mediated versions of these, and in particular, Karl Lutz refers to Russian translations of Renner's and Bauer's texts. And this also shows how important, actually, in the early debates, these broader Russian imperial and revolutionary debates are, in many ways, the roots of this law as such go back to these debates. As Ronnie Kechtman briefly mentioned, the importance of Jewish activists, and these also implicitly play a role in the future genesis of Estonia, because the Jewish activists were the main activists who proposed this model in Russia, and also these activists I mentioned today, they refer back to Bund and other Jewish activists. And the Russian dimension is also important if you look Hans Cruz. Hans Cruz was active in the Socialist Revolutionary Party, attended party conferences, and actually he started publishing his article series proposing this model only a few weeks after a Russian party congress of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which had discussed this very model along the same lines that Cruz later proposed. And here, to conclude, in 1917, Estonian national activists basically integrated the demand for cultural autonomy into their political agendas and discourses, essentially making it into a national demand to protect fellow nationals in other parts of the empire. But in February 1918, when Russia was in a power vacuum and imperial German forces were approaching the Estonian territories, Estonian national activists wrote the Declaration of Independence. One of the blueprints of this document basically emerged from the political circle in which Hans Cruz was active. One of the blueprints was a project drafted by an Estonian poet, Gustav Suits, which proposed creating an Estonian Labour Republic, and which included the proposal for cultural autonomy. And activists writing the manifesto were basically faced with a dilemma. The proposed nation state, although ethnically relatively homogeneous, had minorities. Furthermore, some minorities, in particular the former ruling elite, the Baltic Germans and the biggest minority Russians, did not necessarily agree with this nation-state project. And the solution for this dilemma, although at this stage it was purely declarative, was readily at hand, well debated and known idea of cultural autonomy. And Lutz and Cruz, who had discussed and propagated non-territorial autonomy already before achieving the independence, were surely not the fathers of the respective provision of the declaration, not the latter cultural autonomy law, but their proposals, basically, their debates helped this idea to be included into the later independence manifesto. And what later followed was negotiating and implementing this very principle of non-territorial autonomy in a rather different setting, in a small nation state, first including into the constitution and then passing a separate law in 1925. And this also shows the shift in political thinking in the context of multi-ethnic Russian Empire. In the multi-ethnic Russian Empire, non-territorial autonomy was a national goal to protect fellow nationals, and in the changed circumstances, this model was instead proposed to be applied to protect minorities within the new nation state. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. Also very much on time, as the two presentations were kind of related, of course, and the next one is dealing with a rather different topic. I would perhaps welcome now comments and questions you might have before then moving to the case study on Cyprus. And I'm happy to see Kostas already online. Yes, I see Natalia has a point.
Hi, can you, not very, because both of you have historical aspects and you have probably read the original book that I don't have, or many of us doesn't have chance. I'm very interested about these elements of cultural nationalism. Are they put within the concept of the natural cultural autonomy, or are they existing in these ideas? Are they complementing? I'm speaking about the features of those. Are they a part of this in historical context? Thanks.
Unfortunately, I missed one word. the crucial word. Which element?
Consocialism.
The one word that you cannot pronounce.
Yes, the complicated one. Because there is a difference in some literature. I can find that are complementary, are part of it, but the others they are not. So I'm interested. Are there or elements are there? They are existing. Thanks.
The problem is that I'm not so good in defining consociationalism, but I mean, first I make a short advertisement. Thanks to Entan, we will produce a little video on Renner's model with infographics and really explaining how it works, because it's terribly complicated. So I will not do it, because then we will sit until we will not have dinner. But the basic, or the most important thing to understand is, and here I see I think it has a consociational part and it has an autonomous part. The consociational part, and this was my question to Pete in the morning, is, so when the nations or delegations from the nations, like the president of the national assemblies, would be delegated to the government, or at least to an advisory board of the government, then the nation is part, in a consociational way, with the central institutions. But on cultural affairs, they act autonomously. But that's only for the central state level. What Renner focused most was the district level, because he said the lower you have to, he was in this way he was quite unusual for Marxists. He was thinking that a state works best if things are done on the lowest level, and so he was thinking very much on how to organize the district with the political interests and the national one. And here you see clear consociational, there you see them even stronger than on the central state level.
Thank you. I see online there are both Pete and Roni have raised their hands, so please, short questions if possible. Pete?
You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I had a question for Boris. Namely, he quickly mentioned that the Sudeten Germans developed this far-right version of non-territorial autonomy. And I was wondering whether you know anything about Renner's relation to this, whether There is one book of Renner about the about the Sudeten Germans, not the later one, but the one that I haven't read. Yeah, so broadly, my question is whether how did Renner relate to this, or was he at all involved, or did he know about it, or and vice versa, so the other way around as well. To what extent did the Sudeten Germans base themselves on Renner? And very quickly on the consociationalism, in a way you could say Renner makes almost a perfect balance, or it's interesting how good of a balance he makes between consociationalism and centripetalism. Centripetalism on the central level and consociationalism propping up different ways of consociationalism next to this. Yeah, sorry.
Shall we collect the next one as well?
I answer quickly. Okay. For the far right in general, we have Oskar Muley in our project who knows more about it than I do. Renner was not interested in this model anymore after 1918. Renner was a pragmatist and he had other things to do. He was the first chancellor of the tiny monolingual Republic of Austria, and he never again wrote something about it or tried to promote it. This was done. He was not interested. The far-right Sudeten Germans, of course, they all knew Renner, and they, of course, all knew the Moravian Compromise. And Raschhofer, I think it was one of the protagonists who actually proposed a legal bill in 1936 with non-territorial elements. He wrote that the Renner thing would be good if it hadn't this, I can't translate this into English, den marxistischen Pferdefuß. So, so the Pferdefuß is the devil's horse. So he basically, yes, this could be done, but not in a socialist way. And that's, you know, of course you can think of the far right of Blut und Boden, but you can also think of völkisch. And if you go for the völkisch thinking, then the community is the important thing and not the territory. And the Sudeten Germans were very much worried about what will happen to the Germans in Prague that were far away from the Sudeten German territories along the border. So völkisch ideas can, or NTA can translate into völkisch ideas. Ronnie, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, go ahead, please.
Excellent. I so much enjoyed the two presentations together, Beris and Timo, one next to the other, having following on and off your projects for several years now. And I like the very comprehensive attempt to see, you know, the traveling idea, as you call it, and on the other hand, to get an example of one specific case, the case of Estonia. So thank you for that. My question is actually, how do you perceive the end result of this project? I like that it's a study group because this is too big for one person to approach. On the other hand, it looks like too big for one book to cover the whole thing. So do you have any sense of what's going to be the end product of this amazing project?
Here I have a short answer and a wishful thinking. I want to write a book on that. So this a synthesis. But each work package will be either a book in itself, like Timo's dissertation, or a number of articles. But the idea is that in the end, there should be a synthesizing monograph. It's a difficult task.
Especially a synthesizing monograph. Okay, thank you so much. We can move.